Outsider that I'll get into a little later too, about some of these folks, well, are outsiders in the social sense as well. They're not part of the normal society. So we're going to see quite a few, 7 examples here from Utah. And they're scattered around the states. We've got some in Salt Lake City, some that are still here and some that aren't. We've got some down in southern Utah, at Teasdale and Moab. And we've got a couple over in Millard County that we'll be talking about. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the range of things that are out there and that have been created. But I also want to put these Utah examples in the context, national and international examples, because this is not a Utah phenomenon by any means. This stuff has been going on. I think the earliest ones I've heard of are from the 1600s in Italy. They had a grotto there and a sculpture garden. So we'll get to that in the end, just kind of put these Utah examples in that broader context. But let's get going with the Utah ones. And they're going to be kind of in chronological order. And the first one is the old curiosity shop, or the crazy house. And this was on about 8th East and 3rd South. I haven't been able to pin down exactly where this was. It doesn't show up in the Sanborn maps quite the way I had hoped. But this guy, Anders John Miller, he came to Utah in about 1880 from Sweden, and he was a calciminer by trade. He did whitewashing. And his sweetheart was supposed to come from Sweden as well, but she died on the voyage over. So that threw him for a loop, and it created long-term mental dysfunction for him. And so he was kind of known as Crazy Miller, but people liked him and respected him, and the kids enjoyed him, according to at least one account. But he had this habit of decorating his house up. All the bunting and the artificial flowers and paintings and just all of this decoration that he was obsessed with creating. He also made clay sculptures of birds that he would paint and give to people. So, and this place would be open. So he developed this over time, I think in the 1880s and 90s. And on Sunday evenings, he would allow the public to come and go through the house. And so there would be lines of people out there, sometimes 25, 50 people lined up to go through the crazy house. Now, one other story about why he decorated this way is that, so he was known a bit as suffering from chronic religious mania. So, and he was known as a spiritualistic eccentric. And part of that was, so one story goes that when his mother was pregnant with him, some astrologers in Sweden approached her and said, "Oh, you're going to give birth to the Savior." And so when he was born, he claims that all sorts of people came to the house and decorated the house in honor of his birth. And so that's part of why he was doing this decoration. He was trying to keep up that tradition of the decorated home of a spiritualist. So let's look at some more slides here. And that's just a closer up view that lets you see some of the features just a little better. This house on 3rd South and about 8th East, one of the other things he did in his house is he kept a candle burning for his sweetheart, Olga. So he expected her to come back to him at some point, and he wanted to have the light on for her when she arrived. So he had this candle burning in there. That's not a good combination. Candle burning and all this bunting and paper and everything else. So sure enough, the house caught fire. He escaped with his life, but everything burned. So they found another house for him on 11th East, 343 South, 11th East. And he moved there and started doing the same thing. He couldn't help himself. He starts decorating it. But, and I think the house must have burned in the mid to late 1890s. It doesn't show up on the 1898 Sanborn map. That's the first one. But then he ran into some trouble with neighbors and the authorities. In 1904, there was a newspaper article saying that the neighbors were complaining about him. They knew he was kind of a funny guy, but they were concerned about their kids, even though some of the kids liked him. He didn't get along with the boys. He thought they were devils, and they would taunt him. And some of the parents thought he was preaching odd religion to the kids and that wasn't healthy. So they hauled him in before a judge and talked to him and decided he needed to go to the state mental hospital in Provo. So he had a stint down there beginning in 1904. He, in his own defense, he said, "I'm not preaching to the kids. I'm just speaking the Swedish alphabet." And, no harm done. But they didn't believe him. They thought there was something going on there. I don't know how he got out of there, but he was back in his home on 11th East. And in, let's see if we got one more here. Yeah, this is a better view of the whole property there. So we had quite a nice little property, the big trees, everything set there. But then on January 17th, 1913, his coal oil lamp exploded in the house, and that house burned. This time he ran back in to try to get his cat, and he got severely burned from it, and he only lived for 2.5 weeks after that and died. But on his deathbed, he was saying he was still hoping to see Olga very soon now. So he'd held out this long flickering flame for his fiancée from Sweden. Anyway, this is one of the first that I know of these kinds of places in Utah. So it's 1880s, 1890s, up through 1913. Now let's look at another one. This is a sandstone carving down in just north of Moab, called the King World Sandstone Carving from about 1935. It was created by a guy who was just moving through, and there were a lot of people like this during the Depression years, just moving through the country, trying to find some way to get by. He was camping north of town there. He's still kind of a mystery, They knew he had this various names, and the locals just called him Aaron Andrew. And they don't know quite where he came from. They thought he had a Turkish or Armenian accent. He was kind of an interesting guy. You could see every Sunday he would get in this garb with these big medallions around his neck and kind of parade around military style at his campsite just north of town there. But he also got working on this sculpture, and that's about a 14-foot long, 8-foot tall rock, at least according to the descriptions I've seen. And there's some resemblance there. People think that the figure there kind of resembled him. So, and if you look, so the inscription it doesn't make entire sense, but it talks about being the king of the world, king of America, and there's references, it seems, to Jesus on there, but there's also, oops, I didn't want to do that. I want to do this one. That's North and South America, Asia and Africa. So it's this king of the world thing that he's got going. And this is kind of a common thing with a lot of these outsider art installations. They are about religion or patriotism. So it's God and country are some of the big ones. And some of them are kind of self-delusional concepts of themselves, just like Anders Miller was, considering himself perhaps as a savior. So Aaron Andrew was there in Moab for, I think, about 15 months, a year and a half. And his carrying on kind of got people alarmed there, too. But he did some work for a local family. He did quite a bit of work for Ruth and Dale Perriott on their farm. And they liked him just fine. They thought he was a little bit odd, but they, never bothered anyone. But again, you get an odd character doing this sort of thing, and it gets the local folks concerned. So they finally came up to him in about 1936, I believe, and asked him to leave town. So he did, and he headed north, and the story goes that he got as far as Provo, and the police picked him up and talked to him, and they put him into the state mental hospital there in Provo, and that's where supposedly he died. The Perriotts talked about that they had stopped and seen him there once, but a lot of these accounts are not heavily footnoted and verified, so we just don't quite know what happened to him. Now, this sandstone carving was there north of town, and in the late 90s, around 2000 even, there was a water park put in right there. And some people thought that was not appropriate to put a water park near this sort of dignified sandstone carving, and they called it the King World Water Park. I think that's all gone away, and last I had heard, they'd moved the big boulder into town, and Chris took a photo of it not too long ago. Did you say it was in front of the hospital there? Well, it's just a little more. So there you can see the boulder in its natural setting. There he is with his critters. And that lower right-hand photo is the one Chris took. Now, I don't know if it's the lighting or the coloration or whatever, but it doesn't look like it's doing well, from a conservation standpoint. So that becomes an issue for a lot of these installations. How do you take care of them in the long run, and sometimes even protect them from their popularity? A lot of people want to go see this stuff. Anyway, that's King World inscription. Moving right along, we're going to go down to Delta. This guy, Billy Van Deventer, was from Kansas City, and he moved to Delta right about the time the town was getting started, about 1907. He immediately jumped in and became a booster in the town and everything else, and built started as a one-story building, and I'll show you that. But this is the building from the outside now, and it's in the upper floor that you get this going on. And how that all came about, we'll get into that here. So he starts out, he's always kind of quirky, Billy Van, and he built this one-story garage in about 1917, and he had these Mutt and Jeff, who were local they're not local, but it was comic strip characters of the period. He patterned these figures on the top of the building after them a little bit, and the little signs, "Hey, Billy, how's business?" Later on in the 20s, it might be as early as 26, he built the second story on that building. And if you notice, I'll go back one slide. So notice the arches on that building. You can still see them slightly on that upper floor. They filled them in at some point, but anyway. So, and then the upper left-hand corner, so that's how it was when it was finished. And there is a date in the upper left-hand corner there. I don't know if it's accurate. It says 1926. So he built the dance hall. This nice clerestory brings all this light in. It's really a pretty cool space. But then he starts decorating it. And he's really a handy guy, very clever and mechanically inclined, and has got an artistic sensibility. But he decided to, with crushed porcelain and pieces of glass, he just started spangling this place up. We'll just look at a couple more images here. There was a bandstand in the corner. I don't know what the big dogs are about. He had developed also a batting, some baseball players, full size, that mechanically would swing and play ball. He had a menagerie out back with various critters. He just was trying everything. He was an entrepreneur. He was a bit of an eccentric and really quite talented, I think, in what he was able to do. And he got his family involved in helping do some of this work. It's interesting, too, that though he himself was not Mormon, here he is in this community that's largely of the predominant faith. And so he kind of embraces it. So he's kind of an outsider, but he's trying to embrace the inside culture, too. So he went up to Temple Square, hung out there for a couple days, sketching the temple. Then he went back to Delta and carved the model of the temple with a penknife in wood there on the right. And he had some church leaders come down, and they were impressed. And so this was on display up here in Salt Lake for a while, and I don't know what's come of it, if they still may have it. But he's got other elements that he has added to, these little Angel Moroni characters in the ceiling of the stairwell. There's a couple of these temple models around. One of them is on that big globe in the middle, on the top of the big globe in the middle of the dance hall. Let's see, and just some details. So there's the big globe in the middle, and going around the middle of it was a little track. So a train went in one direction, and the airplane that the arrow's pointing to went in the other direction. So this thing was spinning and glittering, and just this mechanical wonder up there. That 1999 photo, that's Billy Van's son, George Van, who was just a regular guy. He helped his dad on some of it, but he was a jeweler by trade. And then you see in the bottom photo, it really has not changed much since then. Now, the local historic preservation group got interested in this in about 1990. We got it on the National Register of Historic Places. They've done some work on the building over the years with grants from us, and right now they have a grant to do an engineering study because they'd really like to get this upper floor usable again. It doesn't meet code and egress and other things, so trying to save Vance Hall is one of the big concerns for some of the folks down there. And let's see, what else did I want to say about Billy? Well, he passed away in 1942, but his family owned this. So they had an auto parts store down below. And if you notice, I think in this photo here, oops, sorry. When I first went in there were just auto parts strewn all over the floor. It was just a storage area for their auto parts. But they owned it up until, I want to say about 2000. Now it's really owned by kind of a friends group, and they lease out space on the main floor, but they're looking for funding to really do something more with it. Okay, moving right along. So Gilgal Garden is probably the best known of these outsider art installations in Utah. Anyone not been there? Oh, a couple of you. So it's just kitty corner to the northeast of Trolley Square. It's in the middle of the block there. So this was developed from the 40s, maybe 45 to 1963 when Thomas Child died. And Thomas Battersby Child was very much an insider in that he was born here on the east side of Salt Lake. So this is again about 7th to 8th east between 4th and 5th south. He was a Mormon. He was also a bishop for 19 years, and this will give you a sense of how it's all laid out. So there's Gilgal. Trolley Square would be off this direction. Between 4th South, 8th East. But Thomas Child's house is here. So this is right in his backyard, really. And then that's the 10th Ward, where he was bishop for 19 years. So that gets you some sense of what it's all about. And he was a very accomplished masonry contractor. And if you've ever gone up the street here, up 3rd South and at 3rd West, there's the Greek Orthodox Church. Notice the brickwork on that. That's his work. So we worked on a lot of really important buildings and substantial buildings around the city and throughout the area. But let's look at some of the stuff here. And I'm not going to get into interpreting all of these, but he had a very scripted plan for how he wanted this developed. Unlike some other outside artists, he wanted this to be talking about biblical things, Book of Mormon things. He wanted to celebrate the craftsmanship of like his own industry, and patriotism was important to him as well. And so he was in many ways more the architect than the builder of this. He had folks who would help him. So he was retired by this time, and that's common with these outside artists. They're usually retired men, often single, widowed. Anyway, he put together the game plan, and then he had a son-in-law, Bryant Higgs, who would help. They enlisted the help of an artist, Maurice Brooks, and they perfected this technique of doing the carvings with an oxyacetylene torch. It's a technique from mining, I guess. But anyway, really fantastic creations here. And there's compelling stories behind all of these. Now, what he would do, too, is have people come in on tours. And he loved having the young people come in. And he had a set path he would take them on. And even had a phonograph he would carry around, and I guess plug into different places. Because he would stop and present what these were about, play some music. Sometimes his family members sang hymns to kind of go along with the narrative. So this was very much different than a lot of outsider art installations where the creator just keeps creating without a plan. And they didn't really have a single message they were trying to give, where this one was very focused on that. And he's even got a shrine here to his wife, Bertha, though she didn't die until 3 years after he did, so I don't... Here's just some more of the creations, and probably the most famous is the Sphinx with the Joseph Smith head on it. And of course, Joseph Smith was the founder of the LDS Church. So he dies in 1963. His family tries to keep it up for a while, but then the neighbors do. So this is in the middle of the block, and all the neighbors know about it. And the Fetzer family was the one that took care of it for a long time. And they would open it up on Sunday afternoons, oftentimes in the summer months, and let people come wander through and enjoy it. But keeping it up was a problem. But these Sunday afternoon things, or how these things usually got viewed. The Crazy House was Sunday afternoons and evenings. This was Sunday afternoon. It's when people have the time to go out and experience some of these intriguing little creations. So it's declining, and people are concerned about it. There's some talk of development on this center of the block, and that maybe this has seen its better days and needs to go away. But a group rose up, they approached the city, and the city acquired it in 2000. And since then, it's been operated primarily, especially since the early years, by the Friends of Gilgal Garden. And we have some of those folks here, and they can probably give a more accurate and certainly more complete story of how that plays out. But this is kind of a common thing that happens as well, is that these places go through this period where they're flourishing under the original artist. The artist dies or moves on. It gets taken care of by family or friends, and then it gets to be too much. And then they're looking around. There's some folks who are devoted enough to it. They say, we've got to do whatever we can to save this. Some get saved, some don't. But it's surprising how many get acquired by a local government. And then how many of those, the local government works out an operating agreement with essentially a friends group to run it, take care of it. And so that's the story here at Gilgal. Pretty amazing place, though. Now we're going down to Teasdale and look at one that's a very different kind of outsider art installation. It's really more on the end of the spectrum of creating things from recycled materials. And it's less about a visionary creation for patriotism or religion. Tora Sealander Nelson moved to Torrey, so she'd travel all over the world. She was from Sweden, I believe, and ended up in Torrey in 1956, took over an abandoned schoolhouse, and she had all these collections of art and artifacts that she put into the museum just to share. The locals thought that she was a little kooky, but in the 60s, she started building this house. So it was built on top of a basement house. You know the Hope houses that were built in the 30s and 40s? They were just a basement with a roof on them. And they were called Hope houses because you hope you could build a real house on top of it later. So she did. She built this house, and it was from salvaged materials. She'd drag in logs from that she would salvage from wherever, and those became the timbers for the house. But she did the infill with probably, they estimate, about 10,000 bottles. These were beer bottles or seltzer bottles that she salvaged from the dumps, the landfills in that area, and then just packed them in mud, essentially. So the photos here are courtesy of Corey Jensen. I think Corey is the one that was down there and was able to snap these. So again, this is not about a visionary outsider artist. This is more about somebody getting an idea and being creative, either because they don't have the funding or they just think it's kind of cool to build out of these materials. Now the local kids had fun shooting at the bottles and breaking them. So she ended up covering most of them with siding just to protect them. She died in 1988, or yeah, it should be 1988. And is Ken still here? So is the house vacant now, Ken?
Yes, vacant. Her only son lives in Hawaii.
So Ken knows this well, and it's got a lot of other backstories behind it. But anyway, that's an example that I've seen other houses and things built out of bottles, but I don't know of another one in Utah. Now let's go to Oak City in Millard County. And this is Pizzi Aldridge. He was probably third generation living in Oak City, a small little farming village. He went to work in Nevada and California with some ranches for a while, came back to the area and got on with the Union Pacific Railroad. He became a welder and a self-taught welder. And when he retired in the early 70s is when he started creating these figures. And it happened one day when he was just walking by and saw a piece of a combine, and he thought that piece of machinery looked like a donkey's head. So that just triggered this whole flood of creativity. And that's what he did for 30 years, was just create these, this yard art and other items. Let's look at a few more of them, because half the enjoyment of these is looking at them and trying to see what they were, what kind of tools or abandoned equipment that he was able to fashion into these critters. And so he's got the gardening angel there, but there's really no religious theme going on, and nothing too super patriotic either. So Pizzi was just a little more of a tinkerer kind of guy who just liked creating this stuff and adorning his yard with it. He did a lot of small figures as well, as you can see in that upper right-hand photo. And he got known as a folk artist. And so the Utah Arts Council, as it was known at the time in their folk art program, exhibited some of his work. He even got into essentially a juried show in Atlanta in 1991. They had 10 artists featured back there, and his stuff was back there for all 2.5 million visitors to see. So he moved from this sort of folk art, backyard, front yard artist person to someone who got on a larger stage and enjoyed some success, but was always just a regular guy. I like some of these, like these storks up here. You know what their heads are made of? They're the old sheep shears. They're tension mounted. Yeah, and I like the crescent wrench hen and chick there too. You know, those are pretty cool. So this is the front of his house, and that's what you'd get when you walked up to the front gate. You'd see these two women. That one is knitting or crocheting, I'm not sure what it is. And the other one, I think, is doing her hair. I would hope he didn't use his wife as a model, because I'm not sure that would have been appreciated. But this is a sort of quirky place that when people would go to Oak City, they'd make a point of getting off the main road through town and driving by Pizzi's yard and just get out of the car and see what's going on there. So when Pizzi died in 2001, you know, what do you do with the stuff? Well, the family appreciated it enough that they felt like they couldn't keep it like this, so they divvied it up among the family members mostly. And one family member took over the house and remodeled it. And today that's been replaced by a newer house, but there's still one of Pizzi's sculptures out on the corner of the property. So I assume it's still in the family, but I'm not quite sure. So that's Pizzi Aldridge in Oak City. And then, more recently, how many of you have been by this place? Okay, one person? Is that all? Two. Okay. So I was able to get on a tour of this site 2 years ago, and Raphael gave the tour. It was 2 hours long, and he's taking all through these places. And it's not as scripted as Thomas Child's thing with the phonograph and everything. Raphael will just go, it's a very organic delivery of what things are about. But so what is this all about? And I can't read it very well from here, but I'll do it from here. So that center slide, the upright one, says Raphael's Church School, dedicated to teach about the Heavenly Mother and God, Creator, and Jesus. I think that's the most succinct description of his philosophy. It's about the Heavenly Mother, the Creator, God, and Jesus. And then a lot of other stuff woven in. It's just a very complex theology, if you could even call it that he has. So he inherited this auto parts store in 1970 after his father was killed in a car accident. His daughter was also killed in that accident. And there's a whole story about miraculous things that happened at that point, but I'm not going to get into that here. But just to see some of these creations. So the one on the left is actually a little fireplace, and you feed the wood into the mouth, but he said, oh, it doesn't draw very well, and it just smokes the whole place up. But you've got sculpture, you've got sculpture, you've got a lot of writings, you've got paintings. You've got just a whole range of items here. And he does most of this himself. And so a lot of these outsider artists will find a medium that they can do as a single artist. Now Thomas Child needed help to move all his big boulders and things around, but most outsider artists are doing things. They're using stucco, they're using concrete, they're using small stones, or in Billy Van's case, they're breaking up pieces of glass and mirrors. So that's pretty common. It's these creations here, though, and what's interesting, so he's popped up the roof of the second story on one of the buildings, and that center photo shows that. But he's also taken away the floor on the main part in areas to create these subterranean spaces. And when he got digging down there, they filled with water. So you got these pools of water that he's woven into the whole tableau of what's going on here. And there's just some more of them. So on the far right, you go downstairs and then you go through the mouth of this beast and wander back through these caverns. And there are all these critters, the lion and the lamb in the one, and who knows what in others. And then there's also just a lot of stuff in this building. It is packed to the gills with stuff. Half-finished projects, stored items. You can see in this photo here, he's got a car, a classic car. So there's still some auto stuff going on there. But it's just pretty amazing what I don't know how what the fire marshal thinks of any of this, the building code folks. There are also a lot of architectural drawings. This is the Park Building, 1912 drawings from Fetzer and Kennan and Fetzer. I don't know why Fetzer's name keeps coming. So we got Fetzer things here. We had Fetzers with Thomas B. Child as well. So there's just all this stuff, and what do you do with it? What do you do with this creation? So I bet in the last 2 years I've had, 6 or 7 people contact me saying, what can you do? We've got to save this. He's getting old. This needs to be preserved. I don't know how that can be brought about. He's pretty independent, and anyway, there's also a little courtyard behind the building, and he's done other creations out there. And there's Raphael holding forth in the building. You can see a little bit of the outside, the front and the back. So the day of reckoning is coming for this site as well. And I know that the Division of Arts and Museums has had people approach them because of the artistic values of this. They've approached us about the historic values. It doesn't fit very well within our National Register of Historic Places framework because things have to be, this would all have had to happen 50 years ago, typically, in order for it to have withstood the test of time that we would think, okay, now we do think it's significant. Sometimes things like this can be a flash in the pan, and so they don't get listed in the National Register until they kind of hit that 50-year mark. So yeah, I'm not sure the solution here, but anyway, that's Raphael's place. So just putting this into an international and national context a little bit, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with these, but I hope you can see in some of these the same kinds of materials and figures and expressions and symbology that we've seen in some of the Utah examples. It's really pretty amazing as well that there are just some, I'm going to pull out my list here of things that I've noted that are pretty common. Well, and actually I'll just show you a few more examples from elsewhere. And you'll notice these are almost all men. A lot of them are from close to the same time period, some a little, mid 19th century, but more of them are late 19th to mid to late 20th century. There's one from France. Wisconsin has an inordinate number of these. So the upper Midwest had a lot. France had a lot. There are some in various parts of Asia and India. These things just were created. There's one from France on the left. Reminds me a little bit of Pizzi Aldridge's stuff. And then there's some that are really well known, like Watts Towers. So. But all of these have gone through some of that same period of creation, decline, what do we do, and then maybe somebody coming in and finding a way to save them. And I think a couple of quotes here, I think that are pretty, that sum it up pretty well. And this one at the top right by Herman Roosh, they may come simply as sightseers and go away as insight seekers. Thomas Child said about the same thing about Gilgal Garden. He said something to the effect that, well, people may think I'm kind of a nut, but I hope I've stirred their curiosity and got them thinking about important things. But Herman Rush, I also like his where he says, well, it's a good way to kill old age boredom. So you get the really profound and the kind of prosaic take on what this is all about. And then Fred Smith's, nobody knows why I made them, not even me. And I think that's true for a lot of them. It just, they get tinkering with something, they get an idea, and they just run with it. And sometimes it's one thing, like the King World sandstone carving, and sometimes it is one of these sites, we passed it, just the one from Georgia, over 46,000 features created there. So, but here's some of the commonalities. So as I brought some of these up along the way. A lot of these were retired people, almost in every case. They're typically men, some who never married, some who were divorced, some widowed, but sometimes there were families still involved. All of the men were also, well, I'll say for the Utah ones for sure. I can't say about all the other national or international. But the tendency is they're blue-collar workers who take this on. None of the Utah ones were college graduates. I don't know if they even attended. So you get these blue-collar guys who know how to work with their hands, who get in and get this creative bug and start expressing themselves. They typically use malleable and recycled materials, concrete and stucco, discarded bottles, broken glass, mirrors, crockery. And as I mentioned, religious and apocalyptic themes were popular, along with patriotic themes. Neighbors were often not pleased with the artistic goings-on either. I can imagine the people in the neighborhood of the crazy house were just worried about property values. It's like, this is driving our property value down. These artists labored, usually alone, for many years, sometimes over 30 years. They're chipping away at these creations. And if you're doing 46,000 features, you probably need longer than that. The artist's mental stability was sometimes questioned by community residents. We already learned that 2 of them got put in the state mental hospital. So even Thomas Child, this respected guy in the community, a bishop, contractor, there were folks who thought he was a little nutty. And then a lot of these artists, they like to share what they've done, and that's why they open them up on that Saturday evening or that Saturday afternoon and let people come enjoy it. They like to talk about it. Most never charged anything for it either. They just did it for the enjoyment of it. And then, as I've mentioned before, saving them long term usually comes down to a local government that steps in, or a friends group of some sort that takes it on, often as a labor of love, and really that's pretty common. There were some properties in Oregon when I was up there that turned out that same way. the family was just trying to charge money and it didn't work out, and they were really grasping for some group to come in and help them save the Peterson Rock Garden up there. Anyway, so these are the quirky creations in Utah, and I kind of want to apologize for using quirky because I think that may demean a lot of these accomplishments. That's maybe too whimsical of a term, or maybe slightly critical. They're quirky in the sense that they catch your eye. You see these and you want to get out of your car and go check them out. And that's the hook maybe that the artists either intentionally or unintentionally use to think that this is fun for me, maybe other people would like it. So we may have others in the creation stage right now. I don't know of any offhand. These are hardly ever commercial, so I don't get into the ones that are done for commercial reasons, because I think that's an entirely different motivation. A dinosaur park or whatever, where they're just, nothing wrong with that, but they're just not the same as these. So anyway, Corey, you had a question.
Is there putting a hole in the rock in there?
Well, that is one, that hole in the rock, and there's some connections with those folks who created that and with Aaron Andrew. In fact, recently there was an article in the local paper down there, the Zephyr, I don't know if it's a paper or a local magazine, where they said they had discovered a second panel that Andrew had carved with a 1934 date. And it was near that, and so they were speculating about whether the rock creators had talked with Andrew and somehow became kind of kindred spirits. So a lot of these folks don't live well-documented lives, though, so it's hard to just pin down in a linear fashion exactly what went on. Any other questions? Yes, Deb?
Yeah, the dance hall one.
Yeah.
Built over the top of the garage. Was that ever used, or was it just?
Oh, it was used big time. It was a hopping place from the 30s, 40s, 50s. The story I got is, at least from the 50s, good girls didn't go there. But it was the one place, so all the church dances, of course you couldn't drink where you're dancing, but even if you had alcohol in your breath, you couldn't go in. Vance Hall was not the case. They were swinging on the sidewalk almost and going up the stairs. But it was a really hopping place, but it was, had a little bit of a disreputable air. And maybe that's why Billy Van wanted to soften that by putting temples and Moroni statues. Nothing wrong going on here. We're just doing church dances. Yes?
For the Christian school, Raphael doesn't keep the school open anymore, right? He just is there and does tours, or what is it like right now?
Well, he may do tours. I don't know. We got in on one. The one I got in on was through Atlas Obscura. And I don't know if that's a regular thing. I read articles about Raphael, and the one reporter said you just have to go knock, and you may or may not get him. Sometimes he'll let you in and be willing to talk. Other times he's busy. So I don't know. I don't know quite where that stands right now.
There's a kind of interesting, pretty good documentary that's been made on it.
Right.
I can't remember the guy's names who made it, but it's just a couple of years old. But also with Vans Hall, my family's from down there, and the part between the dog and the lion on that back wall, he had an airplane propeller mounted there so he could ventilate the building on hot nights. And he also had a merry-go-round in the back that would close up like a flower, and you'd go into it and get on the horses and stuff, and then as it spun, the flower would open.
Yeah, so that's just Billy Van's inventiveness. Yeah. So yeah, that documentary on Raphael's, you can get that off of the KUER website. So, yes?
I noticed a house in Brigham City that looks a lot like that house up in the corner. Are you aware of it?
That's there now?
Yes.
I don't think I am.
So,
I'm not don't think I'm aware of it, but
Would you like to see the picture I took?
maybe. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, keep your eye out for some of these. Yeah, and let me know. We might find some other interesting ones that are popping up. So, okay, thank you.